The French Revolution is remembered in popular consciousness as a time of political intrigue and bloodshed, whether it be the wild Madame Defarge and the heroic sacrifice of Sidney Carton, or the dashing Scarlet Pimpernel protecting wrongly imprisoned aristocrats from the guillotine, or perhaps a morbid fascination with Marie Antoinette. The common narrative of the French Revolution is that of counter-revolution. But no one is as inextricably tied to the Revolution, to the very heart and terror of it, as Robespierre. Reviled through modern history as a tyrant, a terrorist, a bloodthirsty lunatic with delusions of godhood, it may be hard to see the man behind the propaganda. However, looking at Robespierre objectively, one sees that he was not the tyrant the Thermidorians and those following make him out to be, but rather an advocate for the oppressed, guided by strong moral principles which were lacking in so many of the other corruptible revolutionaries. Maximilien François Marie Isidore de Robespierre's childhood was an unhappy one. Orphaned at a young age, his mother died in childbirth and his father abandoned them. The extended family split the siblings, 2 boys and 2 girls, between themselves. As a young man, Robespierre earned a scholarship to the Lycée Louis le Grand. Education in France was shifting drastically at this time. Students learned Latin and studied Greek and especially Roman history. At this time, Louis le Grand was known as a little republic. This greatly influenced the future revolution, as students like Robespierre and his friend Camille Desmoulins, who would go on to incite the storming of the Bastille on 14 July 1789, were taught about the glories of the Roman Republic only to enter the real world of absolute monarchy and oppression. Interestingly, in 1775, Robespierre recited a speech in Latin to the newly crowned Louis XVI, who was passing through Paris on his way from his coronation in Reims. It was raining heavily that day, and Louis XVI never left his carriage, no way of knowing that the young man before him would, almost 20 years later, give a much different speech advocating for the king's death. On his return home to Arras, Robespierre distinguished himself as a champion of the poor and the oppressed. Many of his clients were too poor to afford his legal fees, or paid only partially. He also gained recognition as a man of progress in his defense of Monsieur de Vicerie de Boisvallée, an inventor who frightened his neighbors by placing a lightning conductor on his roof. But Robespierre would have faded into obscurity as a provincial lawyer with a handful of published essays, had Louis XVI not called the Estates General in 1788. Robespierre was elected as representative of Artois in part due to his support of poor artisans like the Cobblers' Guild. Though present for the first stages of the Revolution, Robespierre did not gain political acclaim. That belonged to men like Mirabeau and the Abbé Sieyès. However, he was later featured prominently in Jacques-Louis David's depiction of the tennis court oath. He is the young man dressed in gold, both hands over his heart in a romantic display of patriotism. Robespierre made a name for himself in the National Assembly when the Archbishop of Nimes attempted to guilt the Third Estate into ending the deadlock between itself and the first 2 estates for the sake of the poor. Robespierre responded, "Sell your coaches, give up your horses. Go and tell your colleagues that if they are so impatient to assist the suffering poor, they had better come hither and join the Friends of the People." This was only the first in a long series of speeches advocating for the poor and the oppressed of France. Robespierre was not Republican at this time. Like many others, he thought that a constitutional monarchy would be the solution to France's problems. A constitutional monarchy would have been effective had the king kept the people's best interests at heart, but his attempted flight proved that he did not. To Robespierre, the time for monarchy was over. Though fundamentally against capital punishment, Robespierre believed that the extraordinary crime of Louis XVI warranted death. Robespierre claimed not to have sympathy for oppressors like Louis XVI due to his compassion for those being oppressed. The king had been responsible for the people, and not only had he abandoned them, but he had also allowed them to live in poverty and desperation while he and the aristocrats profited from their oppression. The question of the king's fate was simple. Louis must die so the nation can live. With the threat of war looming, Robespierre worried that initiating war would leave France vulnerable to a military dictatorship. Specifically, he distrusted the aristocratic Marquis de Lafayette. In his speech on May 17, 1791, Robespierre said, "I have no more love for Cromwell than I have for Charles I." Robespierre was one of the few to oppose Jacques-Pierre Brissot's call for war with Austria in the spring of 1792. This eventually led to a division in the Jacobins between Robespierre and the Montagnards and Brissot and the Girondins. There were other differences as well. The Montagnards believed that the government should be centralized in Paris, while the Girondins were federalists. The rivalry that grew from this division continued until the execution of the Girondins in 1793. In the early years of the Revolution, Robespierre earned the epithet the Incorruptible because he was believed to be untouched by greed, power, or lust. One contemporary even joked that Robespierre would pay someone to offer him a bribe just so he could say he refused them. It is interesting to note, considering the many alleged vices of Robespierre, that the future Thermidorians had to resort to a manufactured scandal using a mentally ill, disabled elderly woman who believed herself to be the future mother of the new Messiah, in an attempt to discredit him. Robespierre believed in the sovereignty of the people. It was the right of all citizens to be involved in the politics of the nation. It was for this reason that Robespierre greatly resented the restrictions placed on poorer citizens. Only active citizens, or men who paid taxes that amounted to 3 days' labor, were allowed to vote for the electors of the Legislative Assembly, which precluded about half the population of Frenchmen from voting. Robespierre also argued unsuccessfully that public servants should be compensated for missed work. He supported education reforms as well as believing that young people in France should have an education that would prepare them for the future careers as well as teach them to be virtuous citizens of the Republic. Robespierre also supported the idea of opening the galleries of the Convention to the public. He believed that the people had a right and responsibility to listen and voice concerns as well as call out corrupt deputies. It was this belief in the sovereignty of the people that led Robespierre to justify and condone public demonstrations, riots, and rebellions directed against tyranny, as they were the manifestation of the people's will. During his time in the Constituent Assembly, Robespierre's main political support came not from the other members of the Assembly, but from the common people, especially women. When Robespierre was accused on October 19, 1792 by the Girondin, Jean-Baptiste Livet, of being involved in the massacres of prisoners, aiming at dictatorship, making himself into an object of idolatry, and claiming that he was the only virtuous man in France, hundreds of women took to the galleries to support Robespierre and listen to his response. Women were drawn to Robespierre, but there is no evidence that he was interested in them as more than fellow citizens. Many historians believe that he was asexual and, if he were interested in anyone, potentially men. Robespierre's detractors hated his female fans, who would often yell and boo at all deputies if their politics did not match the Incorruptibles. On the 9th of Thermidor, after Robespierre's arrest, the Paris Commune called for insurrection from his supporters, including the Jacobins, asking for reinforcements from the galleries, even the women who were regulars there. In April of 1791, during a discussion in the Constituent Assembly on the state of the French colonies, Robespierre shocked many of the other deputies by declaring the French colonies and the slave trade they relied on went against the ideas of liberty and fraternity on which the Revolution was based. He was also against the proposal that the white-controlled colonial assembly should determine the rights of men of color in the colonies, arguing that it would ensure their oppression. In discussions of the new constitution, Robespierre was critical of property rights, property having been one of the fundamental rights of the Revolution of 1789. Robespierre argued that private property was only valid if it did not infringe on others' rights. Specifically, he mentioned the slave trade, saying, "Ask that merchant in human flesh what property is. He will tell you," pointing to the long bier that he calls a ship, and in which he has herded and shackled men who appear to be alive. Robespierre was concerned as well about the discrimination faced by religious minorities and marginalized workers like actors. In a speech on the 23rd of December 1799, Robespierre argued in defense of the Jewish population, "How can you blame the Jews for the persecution they have suffered in certain countries? These are, on the contrary, national crimes that we must expiate by restoring them to their imprescriptible rights of man, of which no human authority can deprive them. Let us give them back their happiness, their country, and their virtue by restoring their dignity as men and as citizens." Robespierre was a deist, meaning that he believed in a higher power, though not the God of any revealed religion. He supported religious toleration so long as the religious practices did not cause a public disturbance. Robespierre was also very critical of the atheism associated with much of the revolution. Atheistic revolutionaries like the Hébertists were intolerant of religion. They destroyed churches, defaced cemeteries, and committed acts of violence against the clergy. Robespierre believed that religious belief was important, especially for the poor and unfortunate citizens of France. He also worried that radical atheism would intensify the civil wars as well as isolate France from neutral foreign powers. Robespierre proposed to the Convention the formation of a new religion dedicated to the Supreme Being. The Convention agreed, and on the 8th of June, 1794, or 20th Prairial en deux, Paris celebrated the Festival of the Supreme Being. It is interesting that a man so morally opposed to violence has come to represent the bloodiest period of the Revolution, but Robespierre, like many other revolutionaries, saw the potential necessity of violence. Indeed, the people's will upon which he rested his political ideas was often expressed through bloodshed. But nothing previous can compare with the historical impact of the Terror. Terror, asserted Robespierre, is merely justice, prompt, severe, and inflexible. He believed that terror, tempered with virtue, was the only thing that could save a republic threatened by enemies within and surrounded by foreign enemies. The republic was in an extreme situation, and only extreme action could protect it. Whether it is to his credit or not, Robespierre honestly believed that the tribunal would not condemn innocents. In early February of 1793, Robespierre claimed that, in the Republic there are no citizens other than Republicans. To Robespierre, the virtuous and patriots had no reason to fear the terror. Only traitors and counter-revolutionaries would be held accountable to the tribunal. Camille Desmoulins, who was a childhood friend as well as having Robespierre as the best man in his wedding and godfather to his infant son, invoked the wrath of the Convention and the Comité de Salut Public when, in his paper La Vie et Cordelier, he contested the terror and called for clemency. He further angered the Comité and isolated himself from Robespierre when, in the third issue, he compared the current politics of France to the violence, tyranny, and excesses of the Roman Empire. Robespierre tried to protect Camille, but Camille refused his protection and continued to criticize the government. Reluctantly, Robespierre signed the warrant for Camille's arrest, along with the other Dantonists, knowing that the result would be his execution. The sacrifice of Camille may seem cruel to modern eyes, but to Robespierre was the only option. He had tried to save Camille, and he had failed. He must adhere then to the incorruptible civic virtue and allow Camille to be sacrificed for the protection of the Republic. This idea of civic virtue above familial and fraternal ties is also demonstrated in The Lictors Bring to Brutus the Bodies of His Son, a popular painting by Jacques-Louis David which depicts Lucius Junius Brutus mourning his sons whose death he ordered after they had attempted to overthrow the Republic. During his time in the Comité, Robespierre supported toleration and urged the Convention to keep its policy of religious freedom, as well as several times seeking to protect Catholics from religious persecution. 3 days after Robespierre's speech to the Convention about the cult of the Supreme Being, he was in a bookshop with fellow Comité member Barrère, when Robespierre overheard people blaming him for the death of Madame Elisabeth, Louis XVI's sister. Robespierre had argued with the committee that her death was unnecessary, but they had still condemned her. "You see," he said, "it is always me." Already at this time, Robespierre was, in some circles, held solely responsible for the terror. In his time on the Comité, Robespierre assigned the fourth least number of arrêtés of the 12 members. Only Couthon, who was frequently bedridden, and Saint-André and Saint-Just, both frequently away on missions, signed fewer. Robespierre signed a total of 544 arrêtés compared to Barrère, Carnot, and Prieur de la Côte d'Or, who signed more than twice that number. Barrère, more so than Robespierre, was the central figure of the Comité. Robespierre was unpopular with his fellow Comité members. His austerity and his virtue were in sharp contrast to the violence and corruptibility of those around him. The different factions of the Comité, as well as outsiders, banded together to condemn Robespierre as the sole perpetrator of the terror. Moderates like Lazare, Carnot, and Landais allied with terrorists such as Fouché and Collot d'Herbois, who had committed atrocities against the people of Léon, Barras and Ferrand of Toulon, Dalion of Bordeaux, and Carrier of Nantes. When Robespierre heard of the violent acts committed by these men, he attempted to have them recalled to Paris to answer for their crimes. Fearing for their lives, they hoped to condemn Robespierre before he could condemn them. Robespierre left the committee, and in a speech on the 8th of Thermidor, appealed to the Convention to purge the government of a handful of corrupt deputies. Robespierre failed, however, to mention the names of these deputies, and many, fearing they might be included, did not support him. The next day, Saint-Just tried to defend Robespierre, but was shouted down. Robespierre, his brother Augustin, Saint-Just, Lebas, and Couthon were placed under arrest. The prisons, on orders of the Paris Commune, refused to hold them, and so Robespierre and his associates gathered in the Hôtel de Ville to rate the insurrection and send encouraging messages to the sections of Paris. The call to arms that would have been sent to Robespierre's own section includes only 2 letters of Robespierre's signature and blood. According to one narrative of the events, soldiers sent by the Convention broke into the room as Robespierre was signing the document. In the ensuing scuffle, one of the soldiers shot at Robespierre and shattered his jaw. Robespierre was guillotined on the 10th of Thermidor, and with him the last hope of the French Republic. According to Michelet, a few days after Thermidor, a 10-year-old boy was taken to the theater by his parents, and at the end of the performance was astonished by the long procession of brilliant carriages that he now saw for the first time. Men in shirt sleeves, hat in hand, were asking the spectators as they came out, "A carriage, master?" The child did not understand this new expression, and when he asked for an explanation, he was simply told that there had been a great change since the death of Robespierre.